Welcome to TechTrends. TechTrends is a podcast series that provides perspective on the latest trends in technology, fintech, and digital. As we approach Cybersecurity Awareness Month this October, today we're going to talk about advancements in cybersecurity technology and how they're helping to protect all kinds of businesses across the spectrum. I'm Anish Bhamani, Chief Product Officer for Commercial Banking, and joining me today is Pat Opet, Chief Information Security Officer here at JPMorgan Chase. Pat, welcome to TechTrends.
Thanks, Anish. Super excited to be here.
So, Pat, we both spent a lot of time in the cybersecurity industry, and one of the things that is always a constant is the amount of change and the volume of change in the cybersecurity landscape. With all of the changes in technology, changes in threats, and other things like that, what are the biggest challenges that you feel like companies face in cybersecurity, and how can we combat them?
There's certainly been an enormous amount of change, really in the technology landscape that is challenging for cybersecurity professionals to keep up with. The advancements in technology, in data, artificial intelligence and machine learning, in the adoption of cloud, and specifically in the empowerment of developers to ensure developers are best positioned to create software that benefits their clients. Puts an enormous amount of demand on the cybersecurity organization to really understand how each of the technologies works. Cybersecurity is essentially a study of failure. And to understand how systems fail, we need to understand how they work so that we can subsequently protect them. And so there's a lot of continuous learning, experimentation required in the field just to keep up with the increasing pace of technology trends.
Yeah, I think that's an important point too, right? Because I think one of the big trends you've seen, say, over the last 10 years is security getting much more embedded into mainstream technology or embedded into business processes. And I think historically, the cybersecurity industry, sort of was successful and got by based on deep security knowledge, which is obviously very important. But I think it's really important for security teams to fundamentally understand a lot more about the businesses that they protect and the technology that's used there, right? So how do you and your team stay on top of those kind of things? And how do you make sure they keep that connectivity?
We certainly see ourselves as an enablement organization. Cybersecurity is here to support the business, both to protect the business and enable the business in adopting both new technology and supporting the businesses that we're continuing to grow. And so for us, it's both a deep integration with our business partners, really working side by side in each of the businesses and specifically the development community there, as well as an understanding of the technology roadmap. Where are the advancements in technology that can make material impact on our business, that can enable more satisfaction or higher degrees of automation or faster processing for our customers, and then to subsequently understand those technologies, understand the security implications of failure, and begin to develop the expertise to detect, defend, or mitigate specific attacks on those technologies that we'll leverage.
So speaking of the attacks, like I said, we've seen the threat landscape change a lot. 30 years ago, the big worry was just about the big companies or the telecom networks. And then 20 years ago, it was phishing of consumers. And 10 years ago, it was more targeting, companies with business email compromise or things like that. What are the kind of threats and how are you seeing those threats change more recently?
It's been such a dynamic landscape over the past 5 years or so. And today, the headlines are dominated by ransomware. And if you think back, just a short while ago, maybe 4 years ago, ransomware was a nuisance threat that was carried out by unsophisticated cyber criminals and really took advantage of poorly defended organizations. Today, that couldn't be further from the truth. You see some of the most sophisticated criminals leveraging ransomware as part of their operations, and it's become a top-line national security problem. Really, the evolution in the ransomware ecosystem enabled what's called ransomware as a service to really thrive, which is what it sounds like. Criminal enterprise providing a SaaS-like service, a software as a service business for ransomware, allowing indiscriminate criminals who may not have an expertise in cybersecurity to come to a platform provider that has various degrees of expertise, from intelligence collection through network exploitation, through essentially cash out and money movement operations. And so criminals can target individual businesses leveraging these platforms. And the platforms themselves have been highly successful in developing and maintaining sophisticated forms of ransomware that are capable of disrupting business.
It's interesting. It almost seems like there's an ongoing sort of commoditization of these threats, right? So, 5-10 years ago, as you said, a lot of the specific financial threats seem to come from large organized crime or things like that, and the ransomware seemed to come from either very sophisticated actors or nation states. What it sounds like you're saying is, hey, the technology's made that much easier. So the threat is not just from the big nation states to the big giant companies like a JPMorgan, but it's from sort of random criminals who are just trying to doing the smash and grab job on the small company that's out there. One of the other threats that we've heard about for the last number of years, and we've actually talked about on this program in past episodes, are destructive attacks, right? And those of us in the industry remember the Aramco attack about 10 years ago. It's one thing to worry about your data being locked up in a ransomware attack, another thing to think about it being totally unavailable. How worried should people be about that?
The simple difference between a ransomware attack and essentially a destructive attack is the presence or lack of encryption keys. And so what we see a lot from ransomware actors is, fueling a business by reliably providing decryption services to victims of ransomware attacks as a method of getting paid. And so we've come to expect that ransomware actors will provide the keys because that's how they get paid and develop a reputation of trustworthiness in delivering their keys. But really, there is not much difference in the attack sequence between what could be a destructive attack or ransomware attack, and it really is the presence or lack of keys that could be delivered or other methods that could wipe computer systems. The most important thing for organizations to think about is really response and recovery in those scenarios. And backup technology has come a long way. And most recently, immutable backups or backups that are written once to backup disk has been a successful mitigant in either destructive or ransomware attacks, where the backup itself is a copy that can't be overwritten, so that if there's a fresh copy of unobstructed backup that's available to recover into IT systems. And so I think we'll see more and more of this. In fact, I think some of the cloud providers are now providing immutable backups for recovery, and I think you'll see a lot of the mainstream data storage companies providing this as a capability that will help neutralize the concern for disruptive or destructive attacks.
So I think that's an important point. There's not a huge difference in the nature of the attack, but it doesn't matter. But a lot of people hear things like ransomware and destructive attacks and they get really flustered. It sounds like what you're saying, which is actually something I believe as well, is it's really a specialized case of resiliency or availability. And it's no different than worrying about, hey, if your database went down, what would you do? Well, that's why you have backups. That's why you have immutable backups. That's why you have redundant systems, or if your data center flooded or anything else like that. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. An organization should think about not just is the backup appropriately protected? Do they have the right methods for automating the rebuild of the software and the systems that underpin it, so that they can rebuild the system and recover the data into the database and get going again after a disruptive event?
So let's turn it around a little bit. So we talked about the evolution in the threat, and now let's talk about the evolution in security technology. And what are the kind of things that companies can do today that maybe they couldn't do 5 years ago? How should people be thinking about that?
I think it's an important question, both for enterprises and for consumers. And I think one of the most fundamental changes in the recent several years that supported, we'll call it cyber safety, is really the mainstream adoption of multi-factor authentication. If you look at both consumer processes and enterprise processes, it's very common now to see multi-factor authentication enabled by technology providers or businesses. And it is a very strong mitigant to protect individuals and organizations from either account takeover on the consumer side or attacks on the enterprise side. Most recently, the emergence of the public cloud has provided a huge degree of opportunities for we'll call it defenders, those in the cyber community, really driven by two things. One, the prevalence of data that is available in the public cloud to provide visibility and detection around what may be malicious processes that are existing in the environment. A lot of cybersecurity is about the collection and processing of data. And for many years in traditional enterprises, cyber teams have really worked hard to be able to collect data from all the IT systems that could be producing it, to distill it down to a normalized set that could be used for analytics, and then write specific analytics on top of that data. The cloud has vastly simplified that process in producing a normalized set of data that's available and exhausted from each of the IT systems, such that it's not an enormous effort for defenders to collect it. Subsequently, there's huge degrees of automation that are available in the public cloud. And so the defender's process can be much more, we'll call it disruptive to the applications in either containing or mitigating a particular incident and allowing the cloud system itself to self-heal in the event of an attack.
So that's interesting. I don't think most people think about that way, right? So having that ability to have large amounts of data, be able to use some of the same techniques we talk about more broadly in technology, machine learning models or deep learning or other things like that in large cloud data environments is an advantage to the defender as well. Since you mentioned cloud, let's talk about cloud security, right? It wasn't that long ago when people like us, or at least me, were like, hey, we can't go to the cloud. We don't feel good enough about the security. And I feel like we've totally, as like the industry has really sort of heard that and has done a completely 180 to the point where the controls in cloud environments are actually often better than what companies might be able to do on themselves. Yet we still hear all the time about companies' data, being breached in the public cloud or other things like that. And I think it's important to note that that's not a flaw in cloud security, but often how people are setting up their accounts in the cloud. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the cloud provides a huge degree of opportunity, but also can be detrimental to companies that don't intentionally construct their cloud environment with the right security principles. If you look back historically at Cybertrends, and you look at annual breach reports that describe how attackers take advantage of traditional enterprise, you'll find that attackers have what's called a dwell time, or a time inside of an enterprise of 7 to 12 months before they're attacked. The cloud is very different. The interfaces that are valuable to businesses to construct systems and the automation that's available to IT teams is the same set of interfaces and automation that attackers leverage. And so attacks in the public cloud tend to be both fully automated and happen in seconds, from exploiting a weakness in the environment to extraction of sensitive or private data. And your point about construction is really a key point for organizations in that their storage buckets or their externally exposed interfaces need to be carefully defended or thought out. Oftentimes, organizations leave what's called access keys or methods of authenticating into the environment in source code repositories that might be publicly available, or they'll configure their storage repositories in ways that are by default facing the public internet. In the cloud, it is a software perimeter that can be easily configured to touch the public internet, and so that's the intentional construction that organizations need to think about, is creating the privacy and the external perimeter, if you will, around their cloud environment in a software-based way, similar to how they would in a traditional enterprise.
So just to sum that up, right? Embrace the public cloud. It can get you a lot to help you innovate, other things like that. But you got to take the security of it seriously and protect it the same way you would internally. You can't just sort of say, great, I'm going to let somebody else deal with that. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And there's actually great new technology, cloud posture management systems to help you understand, where there are weaknesses in either the construction or the operation of your cloud environment that provide that really rich data for cybersecurity teams and IT teams to construct the environment in the right way.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit, right? So um, there's a lot of threats out there, right? You have a team that is constantly monitoring and analyzing, attacks, and the firm employs hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. How do we monitor and keep data safe from cyber attacks in a global firm of this size?
Yeah, it's a 24/7, 365 operation. We have a global team that executes a follow the sun process for defending the firm. So we've always got people on the front lines looking at the signals that we're collecting to determine if there's an attack that's progressing that we need to mitigate. But really, security is a business of analytics. And so a lot of the fundamentals of what we do are really the collection of digital exhaust, which goes into an analytics system and allows us to model what an attack would look like on our systems in ways that we can search for signals in the noise. And so we study attackers and attack behavior. We understand their methodologies and how they carry out attacks, especially those that are likely to attack the financial services sector. And the analytics that we write on top of our data are about signals that would be specific to attackers' processes, so that we can pull out the really unique bits of attack signatures from the vast amounts of data that we typically collect. And so really it's a discipline in data analytics with a strong commitment to cyber intelligence and an understanding of how attackers work.
And the other interesting thing about that is we as a firm of our size are undoubtedly seeing certain attack signatures or threats, like you mentioned, that other people haven't seen before. And I think one of the things we've always said is, look, no one company, has to go it alone, right? So how do we think about sharing that information? Like, this is not generally an area in which companies compete, right? It's one you want to work together on, sharing information either with other companies, and how do we work with the government to help combat this threat?
There has been a significant increase in the commitment to sharing from the U.S. government, and there's a number of key leaders that have been instilled throughout the government that have made this possible, particularly in a year where you've got a war in Eastern Europe. And so between the Department of Homeland Security, Treasury, and private sector organizations like the Analysis and Resiliency Center for Systemic Risk, we've really brought together key sharing mechanisms to allow us in shoulder-to-shoulder fashion to share direct intelligence data with intelligence community operators or leaders at large technology companies and vice versa. And so there have been collaborative platforms that are really built at this point in time that kind of operate like social media platforms where analysts can exchange real-time data about emerging threats. And that's proved hugely beneficial to the resilience of U.S. businesses.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. One thing I would underscore with that is how it really does feel like in the last number of years, the government has become a lot more accessible. What about sharing with other organizations in the private sector, right? So we have things like the FSISAC, you mentioned the FSR, the Resiliency Center. What resources are available for, let's say, smaller companies or any other companies to benefit from all of the effort and resources and money that companies like a JPMorgan or other large companies are putting into this space?
Yeah, it's the information sharing and analysis center networks that have been created for various communities, whether it's a financial services community, the defense community, the healthcare community. It's a network of companies, and particularly the cybersecurity teams that are connected through these, private sector organizations in each of the kind of relevant sectors to enable that level of real-time information sharing, so that organizations that are large and well-funded, that have vast resources to spend on intelligence collection, can pass the unique cyber intelligence data down through the network to all participants, such that everybody benefits. The government often also plugs into to those networks as well. So it's not just organizations themselves that have a peer-to-peer sharing network. It's also the government that's piping cyber information into those networks. And so, for any business, large or small, it's key to be connected to the ISAC community.
Yeah, and look, speaking from personal experience, they really work, right? There's been a number of times where, we get a heads up through that network about a threat that's out there. And if it gives you a 12-hour, a 24-hour head start, knowing that something's coming, right? That's all the time in the world when you're trying to set up a defense around this too. So I couldn't underscore that more. Let's shift gears again. How has the regulatory environment changed over the years, right? There's something, whenever there's a new topic like this, there's never a shortage of people that are adding new rules, regulations, and laws around that, right? How's that evolved in recent years, and how should businesses react to that?
The regulatory environment is certainly more challenging, and it's very complex for a number of reasons. For an organization like us, we do business in more than 60 countries globally. Each of those countries has a set of regulators, one or many, that have specific methods they'd like organizations to progress in cybersecurity or in technology. And so, in many cases, it's ensuring that we can meet the vast degree of variation that exists across a global ecosystem to respond to regulatory requests, or laws, rules, or regulation that are passed by each of those countries. The financial services community, where this problem is acute, have come together and built something called the Cybersecurity Profile of the NIST cybersecurity framework, a unified set of controls that define across the regulatory expectations what is expected of cybersecurity organizations. The reason it was created was it was an attempt to unify the various regulation that we need to comply with in 60 plus countries. And to some degree, it started to take hold in terms of leveraging the FSP as methods for regulation. And we'll see in the US, the primary financial services regulators start to use the FSP as part of their primary regulatory framework, which is a real benefit to teams globally, and is backed by a huge degree of work across many cybersecurity organizations over years to get to that point. In general, the regulators are really becoming more sophisticated. They understand the problem with a greater level of depth, and they're positioned to ask questions that are probing and thoughtful about how teams like ours are progressing in cybersecurity.
So that's good, though, right? You want the regulators to be sophisticated. You want them to ask probing questions, and the regulations are there to protect consumers, to protect customers, and all that. I think the point that you're making, though, is an important one, which is we want it to be easier to incentivize companies to do the right thing and comply with all these regulations. Is that fair?
That's exactly right.
So, Pat, we are a large firm with a lot of resources to be able to tackle these very sophisticated problems. Most of our listeners are not working for large firms of that size, work for much smaller firms, or very small firms. What tips would you have for smaller companies with fewer resources as a starting point for building and maintaining a business that can really be secure against these threats?
The two technologies that businesses should really look at adopting are multi-factor authentication for their workforce to access the work environment, particularly when done remotely, and always when used for what's called, privileged tasks, administrative tasks in an organization. Multi-factor authentication alone provides an enormous benefit to organizations. And then looking at a class of cybersecurity technology called endpoint detection and response, or managed detection and response, which provides a SaaS-like capability for mitigating cyber attacks when they do occur inside of organizations. Going beyond just the specific cyber side of things, I think SaaS platforms in general are built to enable high degrees of management, let's call it, whether it's vulnerability management or configuration, for organizations that really simplifies the IT that small businesses, startups, or others have to run in order to support the business itself. And then the last thing is really to make the investment. Small businesses still must make the investment to be secure. They owe it to their customers. And so making the investment in many cases about finding the right people and building a team, even if it is a small team. Having somebody that's an expert in the organization that can support both the cybersecurity processes and the construction of the technology in safe, sound, and resilient ways is a really important investment for businesses to make, and they should think about that first and foremost.
I think that for a lot of companies, this can be pretty intimidating, right? There's no shortage of technologies out there that purport to solve all the problems in the world, right? And something I always said is security needs to be taken really seriously, but it doesn't always have to be expensive, right? So just to recap what you said, number one, first and foremost, make it somebody's job, right? Like I said, you wake up every day thinking about how to protect a very large firm with tens of millions of customers around the world, right? Make it somebody's job. Number two, focus on who has access to what. So things like multi-factor authentication, privileged access controls, other things like that are important around there as well. The third one I would add is to double down on just awareness among your employees, right? So, you think about things like business email compromise, you think about things like targeted phishing or ransomware and all that. They almost all start with somebody getting targeted. And the more you can get your entire employee base, engaged as, hey, you're all on the front lines here. Every dollar you spend on awareness is multifold more effective than what you might spend on a given technology for a given threat. Would you agree with that?
Oh, it's a great point. I should have said, awareness, it's the users that are typically targeted. So awareness for the role that each employee in an organization plays in defending a firm is incredibly important. And, there's a lot of methods now to deliver awareness to employees or services to test employees on their ability to detect phishing attacks and mitigate them, are vastly available to many companies now. And so a huge part of defending an enterprise.
Pat, finally, looking ahead, if you look ahead a couple of years, what new technologies or trends are you most excited about that you think will impact how we manage cybersecurity in years to come?
All the advancements in how we're thinking about data as an asset, disconnected from applications, really just the management, the analytics of data itself, and the platforms that are supporting our ability to manage, store, share data, I think is super exciting, not just from a cybersecurity standpoint and what it can enable for us as a business that thrives on data, but also as a disruptor to what cybersecurity looks like in the future. We have built an ecosystem around protecting applications or protecting infrastructure before it. Data will be sort of the next horizon for cybersecurity teams in understanding the specific controls or authorizations or processes around managing data as the first class asset, not the application or the infrastructure that supports it. For cyber teams in general, we talked about information sharing as, the method to get ahead of cyber attackers. Advancements in data analytics, in machine learning, and in artificial intelligence have started to show benefit in the cybersecurity community and will continue to do so as we, as cyber defenders, become more apt to working with that set of technology, and data science becomes part of the core curriculum for new hires into the cybersecurity ecosystem. So I think everything kind of end to end around where the industry is going with data both excites me and I think highlights the challenges that are ahead of us.
Yeah, it really is all about the data. You're not kidding there too. So, well, Pat, thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights on this super important topic.
Anish, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And for all our listeners, remember, if you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Tune in next time.